I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office nursing a glass of milk and trying to decide if the New York Giants were actually a professional baseball team or just a collection of men in expensive pajamas when the clock on the mantel struck 6. 6 o'clock at the brownstone is a moment of high ritual. It's when the elevator groans to life and Nero Wolfe descends from the plant rooms like a mountain moving toward a valley. He spent the last 2 hours with his 10,000 orchids and Theodore Horstman, and he usually arrives in the office with the air of a man who has just been forced to leave paradise to deal with a world of tax returns and murderers. The elevator door slid open, and Wolfe emerged. He was wearing his afternoon yellow silk shirt, which on a man of his 1/7 of a ton displacement makes him look like a very large, very grumpy canary. He didn't say anything he never does until he's reached his custom-built chair behind the desk and verified that the world hasn't ended in his absence. "Archie," he rumbled, settling his bulk into the chair with a sigh that would have been a groan from a smaller man. "Is that milk fresh?" "Fritz just brought it in," I said, "and the mail is on your blotter. Nothing that looks like a bomb, though the gas company is being particularly pushy about their latest invoice." He ignored the mail. He sat there, his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. He was waiting for his beer. Fritz Brenner, the finest chef in the Western Hemisphere and the only man Wolfe treats as an equal, appeared with the tray. 2 bottles of Remmers, 1 glass. Fritz placed it on the desk and vanished. Wolfe pulled. He watched the foam settle with the intensity of a diamond merchant. He took a sip, sighed again, and finally opened his eyes. "Well?" "Nothing," I said, "unless you count the fact that the front doorbell hasn't rung in 4 hours. It's been so quiet I could hear myself getting older. That was when the buzzer went off. It wasn't the front door, it was the internal line from the plant rooms." It was a long, frantic buzz that didn't sound like Theodore Horstman's usual polite or out-of-potting soil signal. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a millimeter. I picked up the phone. "Office." Goodwin speaking. Theodore's voice came through and he sounded like he'd just seen a ghost or worse, a mealybug infestation in the Catilla house. "Ah, get up here, now, and bring the black bag." "What's the matter, Theodore? Did a bench collapse?" "There's a man," Theodore hissed, "in the intermediate room, behind the cymbidiums. He isn't breathing, Archie. He isn't breathing at all." I looked at Wolfe. "Theodore says there's a guest in the orchid room, a permanent one. He says he isn't breathing." Wolfe didn't move. He didn't even put down his beer glass, but his lips started to movie pushing out and pulling in, rhythmic and steady. It's a sign that his brain is shifting into high gear, and usually someone is about to have a very bad day. "In the plant rooms?" Wolfe whispered. The tone was one of pure, unadulterated outrage. To Wolfe, the plant rooms were sacred. They were the only place on earth where the ugliness of humanity wasn't allowed to intrude. To have a corpse show up among the orchids was more than a crime, it was a sacrilege. "I'm going up," I said, reaching into my desk drawer for the 38 and the flashlight. "Stay here and finish your beer. I'll let you know if we need to call the meat wagon." I took the stairs 2 at a time. The air in the plant rooms is always a shock-hot, humid and thick with the scent of damp earth and tropical blooms. Theodore was standing by the door to the intermediate room, his face the color of unbaked dough. He pointed toward the back, past the long rows of glass-topped benches. I picked my way through the greenery. There, sprawled across the white marble chips of the center aisle, was a man. He was in his late 30s, wearing a suit that cost more than my car, but had been treated with considerably less respect. He was face down, his right hand clutching a stem of dendrobium that had been snapped clean off. I knelt and did the usual checks. No pulse, no breath. No obvious holes in the suit, but his face had a peculiar bluish tint that suggested his heart had decided to quit the company without giving 2 weeks' notice. But the real kicker wasn't that he was dead. It was that I'd never seen him before in my life. The brownstone is a fortress, the front door is bolted, the windows are barred, and I'm the one who holds the keys. Yet here was a stranger, cooling his heels in Wolfe's private sanctuary, and I hadn't even heard the doorbell ring. I went back to the internal phone. "Wolfe? You'd better come up." And tell Fritz to call the police. Tell them we have a trespasser who forgot to leave. Is he known to us? Wolfe's voice was like ice. Never saw him, I said. But he's holding one of your prize flowers. I think he died trying to take it with him. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the sound of the elevator motor hummed. Nero Wolfe was coming up to the roof, and God help the person who had brought death into his garden. The elevator groaned as it climbed to the roof, a mechanical protest that matched the look on Nero Wolfe's face when the door slid open. He stepped into the humid, floral-scented air of the plant rooms not as a detective, but as a desecrated priest entering a ransacked temple. His eyes didn't go to the body first, they went to the shattered stem of the dendrobium clutched in the dead man's hand. I saw his jaw tighten, a rhythmic muscle twitch that signaled a subterranean rage. Theodore was hovering near the glass partition, wringing his hands as if he could somehow undo the last 10 minutes by sheer friction. Wolfe walked toward the center aisle, his movements heavy and deliberate. He stopped 3 feet from the corpse, refusing to lean over. He hates the physical reality of death. He finds it aesthetically offensive and logically stagnant. I remained crouched by the victim's side, having already performed the preliminary scan of the pockets. Well? Wolfe's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. He's as dead as a Sunday in Philadelphia, Wolfe. No wallet, no keys, and the labels have been snipped from his suit. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure he remained a John Doe. But here's the kicker look at his shoes. I pointed to the soles of the man's expensive Oxfords. They were clean, except for a faint, yellowish dust that didn't match the white marble chips of the plant room floors. That's pollen, but it isn't orchid pollen. It looks more like the stuff you'd find in a commercial greenhouse or a florist's shop. Wolfe's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room. The plant rooms are divided into 3 sections: school, intermediate, and tropicalac, separated by glass doors and regulated by a complex system of thermostatic controls. Archie, check the service entrance. I moved to the back of the tropical room, where a small, reinforced door led to the fire escape. I checked the bolt. It was thrown, the heavy iron bar resting firmly in its cradle. I checked the windows, the steel mesh was intact, and the alarms hadn't been tripped. I walked back to Wolfe and shook my head. The house is tight. Unless he materialized out of thin air or hid in the potting soil delivery 3 days ago, he shouldn't be here. And Fritz didn't hear a sound in the kitchen below. He did not materialize, Wolfe snapped. He was admitted. Theodore, were you out of this room at any point since 4 o'clock? Theodore looked like he wanted to crawl into a terracotta pot. Only for 5 minutes, Mr. Wolfe. I went down to the basement to check the pressure on the boiler. I locked the door behind me. I swear it. 5 minutes is an eternity for a man who knows the geography of this house, Wolfe muttered. He turned his gaze back to the intruder. Archie. The man is not a thief. A thief would have taken the Paphiopedilum on the front bench. It is 10 times more valuable and much easier to conceal. This man was reaching for a common dendrobium. He was signaling, or perhaps he was reaching for support as life left him. The sound of the front doorbell echoed through the floorboards, filtered up through the elevator shaft. It was followed shortly by the heavy, rhythmic thud of Fritz's footsteps on the stairs. Fritz didn't like the elevator. He claimed it made his sources settle. He appeared at the door of the plant room, his face pale, holding a silver tray. On it was a single crumpled envelope. A woman, Mr. Wolfe, Fritz said, his voice trembling slightly. She is at the front door. She says she is seeking her husband. She described him: perfect-lithe grey suit, the height, even the tie. She says he told her he was coming here to settle a debt of honor with you. Wolfe's face went from yellow to a shade of red that would have been impressive on a Cattleya. I have no debts of honor, Lewis. I do not know this man. I do not allow strangers on my roof to expire among my treasures. She is very insistent, sir, Fritz added, and she is not alone. There are 2 men with her. One is an attorney named Graham Vane. He says if you do not admit them, he will call Inspector Cramer immediately. Wolfe stood frozen, his chest heaving with the effort of containing his indignation. The sanctity of the brownstone had been breached, not just by a corpse, but by the legal machinery of the outside world. He looked at the dead man, then at the shattered orchid, and finally at me. Admit them, Archie, but not to the office. Take them to the front room. I will not have them breathing the same air as my books, until I know why they have deposited a carcass on my property, and tell Fritz to prepare coffee. If I am to be accused of harboring a phantom, I shall at least be caffeinated while I dismantle their lies. I headed for the stairs, my hand resting on the banister. The game was afoot, but it wasn't the kind of game Wolfe liked. It was a siege. As I reached the first floor, I could see the silhouettes of our visitors through the grilled glass of the front door, a woman in a dark veil and two men in overcoats waiting to bring the storm inside. I went down the stairs, and by the time I reached the bottom, I had my professional mask on, the one that says, "Im helpful, but not necessarily harmless." I pulled the heavy oak door open. Standing on the stoop was a trio that looked like they had been cast for a funeral in a high-budget melodrama. The woman was wrapped in enough black silk to outfit a small convent, her face partially obscured by a veil that didn't quite hide the fact that she'd been doing some serious crying. Flanking her were two men who looked like they had been carved out of the same piece of expensive granite. "Mr. Goodwin?" the taller one asked. He had a voice like a file on a rusted hinge. "I am Graham Vane. This is my associate, Mr. Arthur Vance, and this is Mrs. Beatrice Julian. We believe her husband is on these premises." I looked at him, then at the other man, and finally at the lady. The names didn't ring any bells, but the attitude did. It was the kind of entitlement that usually ends with me having to show someone where the sidewalk begins. "Step in," I said, stepping aside. "Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied with a horticultural crisis, but he's willing to grant an audience in the front room. Try not to track mud on the rug, Fritz just cleaned it." I led them into the front room, which we usually reserve for people who aren't quite ready for the office, but are too important to leave on the stoop. I didn't take their coats. In this house, keeping your coat on means you're just visiting, taking it off means you're a problem. "My husband," Mrs. Julian gasped, her voice trembling. Is he here?" He told me he was coming to see Nero Wolfe. He said Mr. Wolfe owed him something old, something about a debt from Montenegro. I leaned against the doorframe, keeping my hands visible but ready. "Montenegro is a long way from 35th Street, Mrs. Julian, and Mr. Wolfe doesn't have many debts. Usually it's the opposite. But before we get to the husband, maybe Mr. Vane can explain why he felt the need to bring an attorney to a social call." Graham Vane straightened his tie, a gesture that was as sharp as a razor. Mr. Julian was a man of volatile temperament. He believed Mr. Wolfe had suppressed evidence in a case 10 years ago, a case involving the Julian family fortune. He came here to demand an accounting. When he didn't return, his wife contacted me. We found his car parked 2 blocks away. "And Mr. Vance?" I asked, turning to the second man. He hadn't said a word, but his eyes were busy, cataloguing everything from the height of the ceilings to the thickness of the floorboards. "I am a private investigator," Vance said. His voice was surprisingly soft, almost a whisper. "Employed by the family to ensure Mr. Julian didn't do anything rash." I followed him to this street. I saw him enter this house at 5:15. 5:15, I repeated. That's funny. I was in the office at 5:15. The doorbell didn't ring, and the bolts didn't move. If he came in, he must have used the chimney. "He had a key," Mrs. Julian whispered, pulling a small brass object from her handbag. He said Head had it for years. A souvenir from a time when he and Mr. Wolfe were colleagues. I looked at the key. It was an old-fashioned bit of ironmongery, the kind that might have fit the front door 50 years ago, before Wolfe had the locks changed and the security system installed. It wouldn't open a can of sardines in this house, let alone the front door. "Wait here," I said. "I'll see if the mountain is ready to come to the Mohammed." I went back to the office. Wolfe was down from the roof, sitting in his chair, staring at the empty space on his desk where his beer had been. He looked like he was contemplating the end of the world. I told him about the trio in the front room, the wife, the lawyer, the investigator, and the imaginary key. "Julian," Wolfe muttered. The name seemed to stir something in the deep, dark recesses of his memory. Theodore Julian. A man of immense greed and minimal talent. I haven't seen him since the Settinge affair in 1920, and he claims I owe him. His wife says so, and the investigator says he saw him walk through the front door at 5:15. Wolfe's eyes snapped open. "Impossible. You were at your desk." "Exactly. Which means either Mr. Vance is a liar, or we've got a ghost who knows how to pick locks. Either way, they're waiting for an answer. And I don't think they're going to leave until they see the body. Wolfe sat in silence for a full minute, his lips doing that rhythmic push and pull. Then he let out a sigh that sounded like a steam engine cooling down. Very well. Bring them in, Archie, but tell the lady to keep her veil. I find the sight of feminine grief particularly distracting when I am trying to determine who has turned my home into a mortuary. I went back to the front room. The circle was complete, the motives were beginning to simmer, and the brownstone was about to host a gathering that wouldn't end with a polite handshake. I ushered the trio into the office, and the atmosphere immediately thickened with the kind of mutual distrust you usually only find in a high-stakes poker game where everyone is using a marked deck. Wolfe didn't rise, he sat in his throne of a chair, his eyes moving from the veiled widow to the sharp-featured lawyer, and finally to the quiet investigator, Arthur Vance. He looked like a bored Caesar, presiding over a particularly tedious provincial dispute, but I knew better. His brain was cataloguing every twitch and sigh. I am told, Wolfe began, his voice a dry rumble, that you believe your husband entered this house at 5:15, Mrs. Julian. Archie, please describe your whereabouts at that hour. I was sitting exactly where I am now, I said, leaning against my desk. The front door was bolted, the chain was on, and the only person who came through it was a delivery boy with a case of cider at 4 o'clock. Unless your husband is thin enough to slide under the weather stripping, he didn't come in the front. Graham Vane, the lawyer, stepped forward, his leather briefcase clutched like a shield. Mr. Vance saw him enter. Are you suggesting my associate is hallucinating, Mr. Goodwin? Or perhaps you were distracted? I don't get distracted, I told him. And I don't miss 6-foot men in grey suits walking through the foyer. Wolfe ignored the bickering. He was looking at Arthur Vance. Mr. Vance, you are a professional observer. Where did you witness this entry? Vance cleared his throat, a soft, dry sound. From the cab of my car, parked 20 yards down the street. I saw Theodore approach the stoop. He didn't ring the bell. He used a key, opened the door, and entered. He didn't come out. I waited until Mrs. Julian arrived with Mr. Vane. Key, Wolfe repeated, his eyes narrowing. Archie, fetch the master set. I went to the wall safe and brought out the tray of keys that governed every lock in the brownstone. Wolfe didn't look at them. He looked at the brass key Mrs. Julian had produced earlier. That object is a relic. It would not turn a single tumbler in this house. However, there is a door that does not require a modern key service entrance to the basement, which Theodore Horstman occasionally forgets to double bolt when the mulch deliveries arrive. Are you saying he snuck in? Mrs. Julian cried, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. Why would he do that if he came for a debt of honor? Honor is a flexible term, Wolfe said. Archie, it is time for you to perform some legwork. I want to know where Mr. Julian has been for the last 48 hours. I want to know who he spoke to, what he ate, and why he felt it necessary to park his car 2 blocks away if he intended a frontal assault on my hospitality. And Mr. Vance, I would like a list of your previous employers. A man who sees what did not happen is either a genius or a tool. Vance didn't blink. I have my notes. I'll provide them to the police when they arrive. They will arrive shortly, Wolfe said. But until then you will remain in the front room. Archie, see to it. Then, go to the garage where Mr. Julian's car is parked. If he was settling a debt, he likely brought the receipts. I escorted the 3 of them back to the front room, making sure the door was firmly closed, but not locked. I didn't want a kidnapping charge on top of a homicide. Then I headed for the cool evening air. The grey sedan was exactly where Vane said it would be, tucked into a narrow space between a fire hydrant and a delivery van. I didn't need a search warrant. I had a piece of wire and 10 years of experience. The interior of the car smelled of stale cigars and expensive cologne. On the passenger seat was a briefcase, unlocked. Inside, I found a series of photographs sold, grainy black and whites of a mountain pass in Montenegro. There was also a ledger, but it wasn't a record of debts. It was a list of names, mostly florists and botanical suppliers across the tri-state area. One name was circled in red, Vance Vane Horticultural Supplies. I sat there for a minute, the pieces of the puzzle rattling around in my head like loose change. The lawyer and the investigator shared a name with a wholesale flower business, and the dead man had pollen on his shoes that didn't come from Wolfe's orchids. I headed back to the brownstone, but I didn't go in the front door. I went to the service entrance. The bolt was thrown, but the wood around the frame was splintered, just a tiny bit, as if someone had used a crowbar with a very steady hand. Theodore Julian hadn't used a key, had been invited in by someone who knew the house's weak points, and had been led straight to the one place where a body could be hidden among the beauty of the blooms. I walked back into the office and dropped the ledger on Wolfe's desk. The plot thickens, boss. Our lawyer and our private eye are more than just business associates. Thea in the flower business, and Julian wasn't here to collect a debt. He was here to deliver a message. Wolfe looked at the ledger, his fingers starting that rhythmic dance again. A message, Archie, or a threat. It seems the past has finally found a way to climb the fire escape. I returned to the plant rooms. The police hadn't arrived yet. Fritz was still on the phone with the precinct, likely explaining the situation to a desk sergeant who thought Nero Wolfe was a myth or a Hidashi, so I had a few minutes to poke around without a homicide dick breathing down my neck. The air was still heavy, but the smell of the orchids was being overtaken by something sharper, something chemical. Theodore Horstman was sitting on a stool by the potting bench, his head in his hands. He looked like head aged a decade since 6 o'clock. "Theodore," I said, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't carry down the elevator shaft. "When you went down to the basement for those 5 minutes, did you notice anything missing?" "Not plant stalls, supplies." He looked up, his eyes watery behind his spectacles. "I haven't looked, Archie. I was too distressed by the gentleman on the floor. It's a disgrace, a total disgrace to the cymbidiums. Forget the flowers for a second. Check the cabinet." Theodore stood up unsteadily and shuffled over to the locked steel cabinet where the heavy-duty pesticides and specialized tools were kept. He pulled a key from his packet, real one, not a souvenir, and swung the door open. He stood there for a long beat, his finger tracing the empty spaces on the felt-lined shelves. "The nicotine sprayer," he whispered, "the handheld one with the brass nozzle. It's gone. And the concentrated alkaloid solution we use for the scale insects. The bottle is tipped over. It's empty, Archie." I moved closer. The shelf was damp, and the sharp, bitter scent of concentrated poison was unmistakable. How much was in there? "Enough to kill a dozen men if it were ingested or inhaled in a confined space," Theodore said, his voice trembling. "But the sprayer, why would anyone take the sprayer? It's an antique, but it's not worth a murder. It's not about the value, Theodore. It's about the delivery system." I walked back to the body of Theodore Julian. I didn't touch him, but I looked closer at the suit jacket. Near the lapel, there was a tiny, damp spot no bigger than a dime. If someone had stepped out from behind a bank of ferns and given him a face full of concentrated nicotine spray, he wouldn't have had time to yell. He would have gasped, lunged for the nearest support, which happened to be a dendrobium ant folded like a card table. I went back to the office. Wolfe was still in his chair, but the beer glass was empty, and he was staring at the ledger ID brought from the car. I told him about the missing sprayer and the empty poison bottle. "So, we have a locked house with a broken service entrance," I said, leaning against his desk. "We have a lawyer and a private eye who are secretly in the flower business. We have a victim who was sprayed like a common aphid, and we have 3 people in the front room who were acting like Thea at a wake they didn't expect to attend." Wolfe didn't look up. "The sprayer is a detail, Archie. A messy one. The crux of the matter is the ledger. Look at the dates." I leaned over. The entries in the ledger went back 5 years. They showed regular payments from Vance Vane to Theodore Julian. Large payments. "Blackmail?" I asked. "Or a silent partnership?" Wolfe murmured. Mr. Julian was a man of expensive tastes and no visible means of support. If he discovered that a prestigious horticultural firm was, perhaps, misrepresenting the origins of their prize stocker, smuggling rare specimens from protected regions like Montenegro, would not have gone to the authorities. He would have gone to the bank, and if he decided to raise the rent, then he becomes a liability. But why bring him here? Why kill him in my house? Wolfe's fingers began their rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. To answer that, we must look at what was taken, not just what was left behind. You said the service door was splintered from the outside. Just a bit. Professional job. Then the intruder wanted it to look like a forced entry. But a man who has a kea, an invitation does not need a crowbar. Someone in this house, Archie, is playing a very complex game of musical chairs with a corpse, and they have misplaced the music. He looked toward the door. Fritz, is the coffee ready? And tell our guests I request their presence in the office. All of them, including Mr. Vance, who sees through walls but cannot see the truth standing in front of him. I went to the front room to round them up. As I opened the door, I noticed something ID missed before. A small brass nozzled kind that belongs on a high-end botanical sprayer was, sitting in the umbrella stand by the door. Someone had tried to ditch the evidence in the most obvious place in the house, betting that we'd be too busy looking at the roof to check the foyer. I didn't pick it up. I left it there, a little surprise for later. The pressure was building, and I could tell by the set of Wolfe's shoulders that he was about to turn the valves. I went back to the office and picked up the phone. Calling Saul Panzer at 7:30 on a Tuesday is like summoning a ghost who happens to have a direct line to the city's most guarded secrets. I didn't give him the scenic tour, I gave him the bones. I told him about Vance Vane Horticultural Supplies, the ledger found in the grey sedan, and the name Theodore Julian. I specifically asked him to check the customs manifests for any rare shipments coming out of the Balkans over the last 6 months. Saul didn't ask why I needed to know about flower imports in the middle of a homicide. He just said, "Give me an hour, Archie," and the line went dead. When I stepped back into the office, the humidity from the roof seemed to have followed me. The 3 visitors were back in the red leather chairs, looking like a portrait of high society anxiety. Graham Vane was checking his watch every 30 seconds. Arthur Vance was staring at the bookshelf as if he were trying to memorize the titles, and Mrs. Julian was sitting perfectly still, her veil still down, her hands clutched around her handbag like it was the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. Wolfe was leaning back, his eyes half closed, his fingers interlaced over his mountain of a middle. He didn't look like a man who was worried about a corpse in his greenhouse. He looked like a man who was waiting for a souffle to rise. "Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that didn't hide the edge beneath it. "You are an attorney of some standing. Tell me, does your firm often handle the legalities of international botanical trade, or is your interest in the soil merely a private hobby?" Vane's head snapped up. "I don't see how my business interests are relevant to the fact that my client's husband is lying dead on your roof, Wolfe. We are here for an explanation, not a cross-examination." "You are here for whatever I choose to give you," Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing open. "And at the moment, I am inclined to give you nothing but the opportunity to remain silent. Archie, did Mr. Saul Panzer have anything to contribute to our floral arrangement?" "He's checking the weather in Montenegro," I said, leaning against my desk and keeping a sharp eye on Arthur Vance. The private investigator hadn't moved a muscle, but his breathing was a little too rhythmic, a little too controlled. He thinks there might be a storm brewing over the import licenses. The reaction was subtle, but it was there. Graham Vane's knuckles went white as he gripped the arms of his chair, and Mrs. Julian let out a tiny, sharp breath that hissed behind her veil. Arthur Vance, however, remained a statue. "A storm," Wolfe repeated, savouring the word. "It is a curious thing, Mr. Vance. You claim to have seen Theodore Julian enter this house at 5:15. You saw him use a key, yet my assistant has discovered that the service entrance was breached with a tool, I might add, that requires a certain amount of physical leverage. You are a man of considerable build. Did you notice anyone carrying a pry bar while you were keeping your vigil from the cab of your car?" "I saw what I saw," Vance whispered. "Maybe he had the tool in his coat. It was a heavy coat. And the nozzle?" I chimed in, tossing the verbal grenade into the center of the room. "The one sitting in the umbrella stands in the foyer. I suppose he dropped that on his way in too. Did someone else decide to play hide the evidence while we were busy upstairs?" The silence that followed was so heavy you could have weighed it on a butcher's scale. Mrs. Julian suddenly stood up, her black silk rustling like dry leaves. "I want to see him. I want to see Theodore. You have no right to keep me from him. You will see him when the police arrive," Wolfe said, his voice flat and final. "And they will be here momentarily. But before they do, I have a question for you, madam. Your husband was a man of many secrets. Did he happen to mention a specific shipment of Orchid's Simiath monkey Orchid that went missing from a Belgrade conservatory last spring? A shipment that was allegedly destined for a firm called Vance Vane. Mrs. Julian didn't answer. She didn't have to. The way she slumped back into her chair told Wolfe everything he needed to know. The pressure was mounting, the stakes were no longer just about a debt of honor, and the brownstone was starting to feel like a trap that was slowly, inevitably, closing its jaws. I checked the window. A black sedan with the unmistakable lines of a precinct car was pulling up to the curb. The night shift was just beginning, and I had a feeling Saul Panzer was about to deliver the final piece of the puzzle. The front doorbell didn't just ring, it announced the arrival of the inevitable. Fritz went to answer it, and a moment later, the office was invaded by the familiar, weary bulk of Inspector Cramer. He was trailed by Sergeant Stebbins, who looked like he'd spent the last hour chewing on a lemon. Cramer didn't bother with the pleasantries. He walked straight to the center of the rug, ignored the guests, and planted his feet as if he were trying to find oil. He looked at Wolfe, then at me, and finally at the empty beer glass on the desk. "All right, Wolfe," Cramer barked, his face a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was currently a national emergency. "I've got a report of a corpse in your greenhouse, a man named Theodore Julian, and I've got 3 people downstairs who claim they saw him enter this house with a key. Start talking before I decide to take the whole building downtown as evidence." Wolfe didn't blink. He didn't even shift his weight. "Inspector, you are early. I am still identifying the specific brand of idiocy that brought Mr. Julian to my roof. Archie, give the inspector the highlights. Omit the adjectives, he is in a hurry." I gave Cramer the abbreviated version: the body behind the cymbidiums, the missing nicotine sprayer, the splintered service door, and the ledger from the grey sedan. I didn't mention the nozzle in the umbrella stand, yet I wanted to save that for the grand finale. Cramer listened, his jaw working on a piece of unlit tobacco, while Stebbins took notes with the grim efficiency of a court reporter at a hanging. Horticultural supplies. Cramer muttered, glancing at Graham Vane and Arthur Vance. "Vance and Vane. I know the name. You guys handle the imports for the big floral shows, don't you?" "We are a legitimate business, Inspector," Vane said, his voice tight. "Mr. Julian was a consultant. He had certain connections in Europe that were valuable to us. His death is a tragedy, but it has nothing to do with our professional conduct. Consultant is a polite word for a man who knows where the bodies are buried," I remarked. "Or in this case, where the orchids are smuggled." The office phone rang. I picked it up. It was Saul Panzer. He didn't waste time. "Archie, I've got the manifests. Vance Vane brought in a shipment of ornamental shrubs from Montenegro 6 weeks ago, but weight does not equal volume, and I checked the back end of the Julian estate. Theodore was broke, but he just bought a villa in Menton. The down payment came from a holding company in Delaware. "Thanks, Saul. Keep the line open." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. I gave him a short, sharp nod. The pressure was exactly where it needed to be. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes snapping shut for a second before opening with a terrifying clarity. "Inspector, killing Theodore Julian was no crime of passion. It was a strategic extraction. Mr. Julian had become too expensive. He was the middleman in a smuggling operation that used the cover of legitimate botanical trade to move high-value protected species and, perhaps, Morinto, this country. But he made a mistake. He believed that by bringing his grievance to me, he could leverage his safety. He was wrong. He was followed." "By who?" Cramer demanded. "By the man who saw him enter," Wolfe said, his gaze landing on Arthur Vance. "Mr. Vance, you claim to have seen him at 5:15, but the service door was breached earlier. You didn't see him enter, you let him in. You had the tool, you had the motive, and you had the sprayer." Arthur Vance didn't move. He didn't even blink. "That's Ali. I was in my car." "Then how?" Wolfe asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room. "Do you explain the fact that your coat smells of concentrated nicotine, a scent that is currently clinging to the upholstery of the front room chairs where you sat waiting for your client to appear?" Vance's face went the color of wood ash. He looked at Graham Vane, then at the widow, but nobody was looking back. The room was suddenly very small, and the silence was being measured by the ticking of the clock. Wolfe wasn't guessing he was positioning the pieces for the final kill. "Inspector," Wolfe said, turning back to Cramer, "I believe Sergeant Stebbins will find a very interesting piece of brass in the umbrella stand. It belongs to a sprayer that is currently missing from my plant rooms, a sprayer that Mr. Vance used to silence a man who knew too much about the soil in Montenegro." Cramer looked at Stebbins, who headed for the hall. The pressure cooker had finally blown its lid, and the mess was about to be very, very public. The office had become a courtroom, though the judge was behind a desk instead of a bench, and was more interested in the properties of a rare hybrid than the penal code. Sergeant Stebbins returned from the hallway, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. In his gloved hand he held the brass nozzle ID seen earlier. He didn't say a word, he just placed it on the blotter in front of Inspector Cramer. The light from the desk lamp caught a polished metal, making it shine like a guilty conscience. Wolfe didn't look at the nozzle. He was staring at the three people in the red leather chairs, his eyes moving with a slow, predatory grace. "The gathering is complete," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that deep, resonant register that usually means someone is about to be dismantled. "We have the widow, whose grief is as layered as an onion and likely as manufactured. We have an attorney whose firm is a front for a black market botanical empire, and we have the investigator, a man who sees through walls but cannot see the noose tightening around his own neck." Graham Vane straightened his silk tie, his face a pale mask of defiance. "This is the theatre, Wolfe. A piece of brass in an umbrella stand proves nothing. Anyone could have put it there. Your own assistant, perhaps, to tidy up a messy situation." "Archie does not tidy up by leaving clues in plain sight," Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing. "He is far too efficient for such amateurism. No, someone who was interrupted placed the nozzle there. Someone who had intended to dispose of the entire sprayer, but was forced to ditch the most incriminating part when Fritz opened the door. And that someone is currently sitting in this room, smelling of the very poison that ended Theodore Julian's life." Cramer leaned in, his shadow looming over the desk. "You're talking about Arthur Vance, but he says he was in his car. How did he get in, Wolfe? And why kill him here?" "He got in because Mr. Julian invited him," Wolfe said, leaning back and interlacing his fingers. "Theodore Julian was not a victim of a break-in. He was a man who believed he held the upper hand. He had been blackmailing Vance Vane for years, using his knowledge of their smuggling routes in the Balkans to fund his lifestyle. But the price had become too high. When Julian summoned Mr. Vance to this street, he thought he was negotiating a final payout. He didn't know he was inviting his own executioner. "And the door?" I asked, playing the part of the inquisitive observer. "The splintered wood?" "A diversion," Wolfe murmured. "A clumsy attempt to suggest a forced entry by a stranger. But a stranger would not have known where the nicotine sprayer was kept. A stranger would not have known that Theodore Horstman leaves the plant rooms for exactly 5 minutes every afternoon to check the boiler. Only someone with intimate knowledge of this household Somione, who has perhaps been watching us for weeks, would have known when the sanctuary was unguarded." Wolfe turned his gaze back to Arthur Vance. The private investigator hadn't moved, but his eyes were darting toward the door, measuring the distance to the hallway. "You didn't see him enter at 5:15, Mr. Vance. You entered with him. You led him to the roof under the guise of a private meeting, a neutral ground where the debt could be settled. You used my own tools to commit the deed, believing that the confusion of a corpse in my house would buy you the time you needed to vanish. But you underestimated the olfactory sensitivity of a man who lives for his garden. You can't prove I was on that roof," Vance whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "I don't need to," Wolfe said, his voice like a falling axe. "The inspector will find the rest of the sprayer in the trunk of your car, hidden beneath a spare tire, and he will find the residue of the nicotine on your gloves. You were so concerned with the nozzle that you forgot the most basic rule of the assassin: never keep the weapon. You are a man of many talents, Mr. Vance, but your knowledge of botany is unfortunately fatal." Cramer didn't wait for another word. He nodded to Stebbins, who moved toward Arthur Vance with a pair of handcuffs glinting in the low light. The office was suddenly filled with the sound of chairs scraping and the sharp, panicked intake of breath. The circle was broken, the strategy had reached its end, and the intellectual justice that Wolfe craved was finally being served. The silence that followed the handcuff ratcheting was deeper than any shout could have been. Arthur Vance sat slumped, the defiant rigidity of a professional observer finally dissolving into the hollowed-out posture of a man who had been caught in a web of his own weaving. Cramer stood over him, a massive, unyielding presence, while Stebbins began the formal process of cautioning the prisoner. But Wolfe wasn't looking at the handcuffs. He was looking at Graham Vane, whose face had transitioned from the pale mask of an attorney to the ashen grey of a man watching his empire crumble. "The reveal, Mr. Vane, is rarely about the weapon," Wolfe said, his voice regaining its dry, academic tone. "It is about the necessity of its use. You and your associate did not kill Theodore Julian because he was a blackmailer. You killed him because he had become a competitor. The ledger Archie recovered from the car was not merely a record of past payments. It was a roadmap of a new operation. Mr. Julian had been using his own smuggling routes in Montenegro to move his own cargo that was far more lucrative than rare orchids." Graham Vane licked his lips, his eyes darting toward the exit. "You're speculating, Wolfe. You have no proof of any cargo." "Speculation is for those who lack information," Wolfe countered, gesturing toward the telephone. "Mr. Saul Panzer has spent the last hour communicating with certain contacts in the Balkans. Apparently, while Vance Vane were busy importing ornamental shrubs, Mr. Julian was using those same shipments to move stolen antiquita, specifically Byzantine icons from a monastery near Cetinge. He was using your infrastructure to run his own high-stakes game. When you discovered the discrepancy in the shipping weights, you realized your consultant was not just a leech, he was a rival who could bring the federal authorities down on your entire enterprise." Cramer turned his head sharply. "Antiquities. We're talking about international smuggling on a diplomatic scale." "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "Theodore Julian was a man of immense greed, but he was also a man of habit. He believed that by meeting Mr. Vance here, in my home, he would be safe. He thought I was a shield. Instead, he found himself in a cage. Mr. Vance did not just stumble upon the nicotine sprayer, he had scouted this house for weeks. He knew when Theodore Horstman would be in the basement. He knew that a man killed by a concentrated alkaloid spray in a humid greenhouse would appear to have suffered a sudden natural cardiac event to any but the most discerning eye." Wolfe shifted his gaze to the widow. Beatrice Julian had not moved, but her gloved hands were now shaking so violently that the black silk of her dress seemed to shiver. "And you, madam, you were the ultimate theatre piece. Your arrival at the front door, the story of the debt of honor, the antique keyhole of it, was designed to provide a narrative that would point away from the flower trade and toward a phantom past. You expected us to find the body, hear your tragic tale, and conclude that an old ghost had finally come to claim his due. You did not expect Archie to find the pollen on the shoes or the nozzle in the umbrella stand. It was his idea," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. She pointed a trembling finger at Graham Vane. "He said Theodore was going to get us all killed. He said if we didn't stop him, the people in Montenegro would come for us. I didn't want him dead, but I couldn't go to jail. Not for those icons." "Beatrice, be quiet," Vane hissed, but it was too late. The admission was out, hanging in the air like the scent of the poison that had started it all. Cramer didn't need any more. He signaled Stebbins to take them all out. "Antiquities, orchids, and a nicotine sprayer. Only in this house, Wolfe, only in this house." As the office cleared and the heavy police tread faded down the hall, Wolfe leaned back in his chair. He looked older, tired, and deeply offended. The justice he had delivered was absolute, but it had come at a price he loathed to pay. The peace of his brownstone had been shattered, and the sanctuary of his roof would never quite feel the same again. He stared at the empty space on his desk, his fingers finally stilling their rhythmic dance. The case was closed, the reveal was complete, and all that remained was the cleaning of the glass. The brownstone had finally exhaled. The heavy tread of Inspector Cramer's boots had faded from the hallway, and the siren of the last precinct car had wailed its way toward 9th Avenue, leaving behind a silence that was almost heavy enough to touch. I stood by the office window, watching the city reclaim its usual rhythm of shifting shadows and distant taxi horns. The air in the house still carried a faint clinical sting of police disinfectant and the ghost of that bitter nicotine spray, but the primary intruder's jagged tension of a violent death had been escorted out in handcuffs. I turned back to the room. Wolfe was still in his chair, his eyes closed, his chin resting on his chest. To a stranger, he might have looked asleep, but I could see the slight, rhythmic movement of his thumbs. He was decompressing, a process that usually took as much energy as the investigation itself. Fritz appeared in the doorway, no longer pale or trembling, but carrying a tray with the quiet purpose of a man who knew exactly how to restore order to a tilted world. "The bouillon is ready, Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said softly, "and I have prepared the truets en papilote for dinner. I thought perhaps something delicate would be appropriate after such a robust afternoon." Wolfe opened one eye. "Delicate, Fritz. I have spent the last 4 hours breathing the fumes of a horticultural slaughterhouse. My palate has been assaulted by the scent of concentrated alkaloids and the conversational dross of a smuggling ring. I require substance, not whimsy. However, the trout will suffice, provided the herbs are fresh. They are from the morning market, sir," Fritz promised, bowing slightly before retreating to the kitchen. I sat at my desk and pulled the typewriter toward me. I had a report to finish, and I knew Wolfe would want it filed before he went back up to the plant rooms at 9 tomorrow morning. "You know, Wolfe," I said, clicking the carriage return. Vance almost pulled it off. If he hadn't been so worried about that brass nozzle, he might have walked out of here while we were still arguing about the front door bolts. It was a nice touch, using your own sprayer. It gave the whole thing a local flavor, Wolfe grunted, a sound of deep, resonant dissatisfaction. "It was not a nice touch, Archie. It was an act of supreme arrogance. Mr. Vance viewed this house not as a fortress but as a laboratory. He believed that because I am sedentary, I am unobservant. He forgot that the stillness of a spider is not a sign of lethargy but of extreme concentration. He saw the plants, but he did not understand the environment. To commit a murder in a greenhouse requires a respect for the atmosphere that he simply did not possess." "Well, he's got plenty of atmosphere now," I remarked. "Between the homicide charge and the federal heat for those smuggled icons, he won't be seeing any orchids for a long, long time. And the widow? Do you think she'll beat the conspiracy rap?" "It is immaterial," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a final, philosophical register. "Whether she spends her years in a cell or in a gilded parlor, her own greed already imprisons her. She sought to transform the beauty of the Balkans into a ledger entry. In doing so, she became as hollow as the crates she used for her icons. Human folly, Archie, is the only weed that cannot be eradicated by a nicotine spray. It requires a more permanent pruning." He stood up, his massive frame rising with a slow, deliberate dignity that seemed to push the last of the afternoon's gloom out of the corners of the room. He walked toward the elevator, his yellow silk shirt catching the light from the desk lamp. He stopped at the door and looked back at me, his expression unreadable. "Archie, tell Theodore that the dendrobium is to be discarded. I will not have a plant in my collection that has been touched by a dying blackmailer's hand, and remind him to double-bolt the service entrance. I have no desire to host any more colleagues from my youth." "You got it, boss," I said, hitting the final key on the typewriter with a satisfying thud. "I'll even check the chimney, just in case any more ghosts are feeling nostalgic." The elevator door slid shut, and the hum of the motor signaled that the master of the house was returning to his sanctuary. I leaned back, picked up my glass of milk, and looked at the empty office. The orchids were safe, the beer was cold, and for at least another 12 hours, the world of 35th Street was exactly the way it was meant to be.